Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. Um, I just want to do a little bit of some setting up here. You can, while we are doing the artist talk here, you can definitely add to the chat box. And in between questions or towards the end of my introduction, I will be looking at those questions in the chat box. Okay. So, welcome. I'm going to do a brief introduction here. Rossitza Todorova was born in Sofia, Bulgaria. Rossi immigrated to the United States as a child. She received her Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from the University of Nevada, Reno in 2005, and her Master of Fine Arts degree from Arizona State University in 2013. Rossi is currently a full-time studio art instructor at Truckee Meadows Community College in Reno, Nevada. My name is Claudia Morales McCain, and I am a painter and educator living and working in the Bay Area. Rossi and I have a couple of passions in common. We're both very dedicated to our art practice and our teaching practice. Rossi and I developed a friendship over the last 6 months by connecting and sharing about this quick pivot to remote instruction. Rossi and I also share in the collective story of immigration and displacement. So Rossi and I met last week and took a look at the arc of her work over the last 10 years. And in looking at the work, I was able to ask her about the threads that I was seeing kind of weaving in and out of the work. And I thought that this would be a lovely opportunity for us to look at that and then hear Rossi's thoughts about it. So Rossi will share the presentation.
Yeah, and hi everybody. I'm so excited that everybody's here. Thank you for joining us. And I'm going to share my presentation with you guys and start talking about it. Let me just make it full screen. Hopefully everybody can see that. Okay.
Great. So one of the first bodies of work that I focused on in looking on the website here was that in 2013, you had a show titled Intersections. And the pieces in the work have a ribbon that flows into the paintings and simultaneously sometimes enters and recedes in the picture plane. One can almost feel the air lifting and reshaping not only the ribbon, but the landscape, the shape, and the space. Can you elaborate more about your interest in looking at landscape as metaphor?
Absolutely. So in this series of work, I was really thinking about how we experience place, and we experience place through time. And so you might be asking yourself, well, what does that mean? And the way that I think about that is if you take something like travel, which maybe many of us aren't doing at the moment, but it used to be something we used to do all the time, like commuting, even a trip to the grocery store. But if you imagine like your last set of travel, and not only those highlights of like an amazing trip, but also kind of the minutia, like what it took to pack, like you leaving from your front door, having that experience of traveling and then coming back. If you were to take that whole time period and compressed it into a two-dimensional image, what would it look like? And so that's really the entryway for me with a lot of these pieces, where I am thinking about how we layer space through and landscape through experience, and how different experiences have not only like color and a feeling of a specific feeling to them, and trying to capture that through a 2D format. So I'm really abstracting that space and abstracting that landscape and layering it in a non-conventional way, where you don't necessarily see a perfect horizon line, but you still feel a deep pictorial space, the interaction with man-made infrastructure, that process of like moving through a space hopefully is happening within dynamic ways that I'm creating a composition. And there's also a bit of how I'm making this specific series of work that is important. So all of these are started with printmaking. So starting them with lithography with shapes that are all somewhat similar, and then going back in and investigating and layering different dry and wet mediums on top of them. They, for me, kind of recreated that experience of travel or uh, ex- dealing with a built infrastructure or like a built space. So I always think that the roads are underneath our feet, but our experience on that road is always different, even though that infrastructure is often the same. Um, so that's part of how I'm approaching that. Claudia, does that start to answer your question?
Yes, definitely. And moving into the next body of work, these
Yeah.
pieces. In looking at the next couple of slides, I was super intrigued with your multidisciplinary approach to the work, and you're working through these ideas with your hands. So,
Mm-hmm.
what were you searching for and exploring in paper loop constructions?
Yeah. So one thing that happened, or sometime through the creation of the previous body of work that we were just talking about, is that previously to that, I was doing a lot of driving, and so a lot of the work was really um, kind of based or uh, driving was very much a part of the work itself and how we experience our life in the car. And it was a time when I had an hour commute each way to where I was living. So the time in the car was really quite inspirational, but also took such a chunk of my time. And a lot of times that commuting happened with my husband, so I could actually draw from the passenger seat of the car. And then we ended up moving closer to school, and so I lost like all of my visual vocabulary that had to do with how we experience landscape, um, like looking through that passenger window. And so I decided that I what I really wanted, or what I needed, was to create still lives that I could start to reference while creating the work that was still talking about a roadway and infrastructure. And so I started to make still lives like this. And then after creating them, I really felt like they themselves were pieces that I wanted to keep. I wanted them to continue to exist past a period of time of me just referencing them in the studio. And so I started to go into book arts and really to think about how I could make these pieces collapse and then come back together or come back out. And so what you're looking at here are book forms with both kind of accordion style book forms, or ones that have like different kinds of binding that fold away into a flat space and then can expand back out through setting up these books as really being sculptural. But I was really fascinated or interested in how you just mentioned that, something that I was really observing, all of a sudden I was getting to make and actually recreate and really think about, well, what does a metaphor of that infrastructure mean to me? Like, how can I start to depict that or create that through line and form? And like one thing that I've always thought is that as humans, as a man creates a line and nature creates a circle. And so, in many ways, trying to really think about that as metaphor too, that um, these lines in the work are representing like man-made space, and then curves or circles in the work are going to be representing nature. And then also what happens when we bend that man-made space, it all of a sudden becomes so much more natural. So I'm really kind of curious about that interaction between the visual vocabulary and what happens when they are taken into a physical space.
Well, and I think it's super fascinating that they went from the 2D design work, or I'm sorry, 2D work to the 3D format. But I am interested. The piece on the left, the contained path book, feels like an intimate scale. Was
Yeah.
is that an important component to the work, like the ability to hold, or the what is that? What role is that playing in the work?
That's a really good question. I in terms of scale, I do. I, there's a process of like opening and closing these pieces that I think becomes very very intimate and feels intimate. Like I think that within the work, I'm often talking about kind of two things. This space that we occupy, and then our interaction with it. And so I think that in terms of scale, the books become that interaction um, with something that is mm, almost bigger than us, if that makes sense. Like this infrastructure feels like it's encompassing,
Yeah,
and yet we have a very personal experience with it. And so I do think that something about handling and setting up, and opening these books, and holding it um, does have that
when I
process.
when I looked at these books, I just kept thinking that these were like a beautiful encapsulation of this expansive unknown passage, and that was embedded into. And this is just me, obviously
Yeah,
projecting my experience onto it, but that was the part that I thought was really beautiful, really tender,
thank you.
actually, about the piece on the left. So, in moving on to the next body of work that I wanted to discuss here.
Yeah, and I'm gonna just keep going through these slides. These were just a couple of other books that we were looking at, and and there is something. I mean, just to respond to what you were just saying. Um, I just always feel like our lives are in loops, and um, and there is a relationship between um, this ability to like move out into the world and then come back to the same place where you started. And so there is this cyclicalness that I'm trying to represent with that ribbon, um, as well as with some of these forms.
Mhm.
So I think that you're asking about this piece next.
Yes. So, I mean, we can definitely
Yeah,
piggyback on the idea that you were like looking for new meaning, right, in the growing structure book. So, in
absolutely.
looking at the next body of work where you were working with sculpture and video, what is video doing in the installations that the 2D is missing? So,
Yeah,
I
and I
get
would love to
the
actually.
Go ahead. I was going to say, I get the feeling that you're going back and forth between the two mediums is about working out this longing for a sublime experience. And so, my question to you, in looking at this work, and again, projecting my own experience or imagining myself in the space, what role does nostalgia or longing play in the work, if any?
Yeah, and I would love to go into that idea of nostalgia when we get to the next slide. I do want to just kind of create an arc between the last body of work and this body of work. So when starting to work with these book forms, they really turned into installation. So that intimacy of that smaller scale all of a sudden started to occupy a much bigger space. And while making these kinds of installations, I was really interested in them being temporary, and that they were not that there were things that weren't permanent, that they actually were something that would disappear um, after the installation. And so for something like this, the vocabulary that starts to come into play is this big structure that is actually made out of foam core and silver tape. So something that looks really heavy and sturdy and almost metallic, but in reality is something quite fragile and temporary. And then creating a space with black tape that's adhered to the wall. So something that again feels like it has a really deep pictorial space, where I'm thinking about how we're representing and thinking about time. So within this specific installation, really it's multiple ways that we interpret time. So how long does it take to get somewhere? This idea of distance is measured in time. The form itself, the sculptural form, is actually created out of a long rectangular form that then is folded into this diamond shape. And so for me, this idea of a long rectangle starts to represent how we think about time as being linear and historical. But in reality, that's not how time works, and it's not how our memory works. Instead, our memory creates, which is really the only way we can travel in time is our memory, creates connections. And those connections are not obvious and they're not linear. And so within this form, I'm really representing an idea of memory. And then the sculpture itself is creating a salt pyramid. And the sculpture also was creating that salt pyramid with salt in the bottom that would slowly come out and continue to create the salt pyramid, thinking about this passage of time. And within this few installations that I created like this, I started to use old school slides. And the slides were of diamonds. And I got really interested in how I could project light through the sculpture and start to create this play and shadow. And the reason why I'm mentioning all of this is it's actually important in how I got to video. So it was through this process of creating installation and starting to think about how I could also cast shadow by using an image that was created by a slide that I actually started to work with video because I was interested in that same process. And so I'll go to the next slide. And talk a little bit about that. Maybe I'll actually skip back and forth. I want to get to this image. And so within the first time that I really used video was in a couple of versions of this installation where I projected video through a sculpture, and the sculpture itself is interacting with the video and and creating a shadow. And the reason why this was really important and starting to really answer your question is these pieces start to be about longing. So I created this series of work right after my father had passed away, and the structure of the sculpture became a representation of how I was really trying to hold myself together and trying to use this geometry and infrastructure to keep myself connected, and yet this piece while installed is actually turning, and the videos are also in motion, and so the feeling that you get is for something that's out of control, so something that feels like it's falling away from you, and that you really have you're in the process of experiencing it, but you don't necessarily have control of it. Even though if you concentrate on that sculpture in the middle, it feels, really sturdy. But yet I was really looking for a way to describe this tumultuous feeling of almost vertigo, just feeling like everything was in flux. And so I feel like that's starting to answer a bit of your question. Could you help me redirect, because I feel like you're asking something else about video in terms of that idea of the sublime.
Yeah, I mean, I was really interested in the back and forth that happens between the 2D and then you started working with the book form and then the video, right? And this question of like, what are you searching for, or
Yeah.
what meanings are you looking to find, or what is 2D missing? Because there is a constant exploration in all of these, like this multimedia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I definitely feel like I have been like going back and forth between two-dimensional forms and three-dimensional forms, and while exploring something in 2D, feeling like I need to like pop it back out, like make it come back out of the form, um, and then flatten it back in. I do think just formally, I do think that that has a lot to do with um, wanting to abstract something, but really wanting the thing that I'm abstracting to be um, from life rather than imagination. So sometimes, like, creating the thing that I need to abstract is important, but also um, I still see these as drawings. I mean, a lot of times, like even with these three-dimensional forms, for me, they're drawings that I get to make in 3D space, and their interaction with their shadow is just as important as their physical appearance. And there's a times, mostly through documentation, that the work feels flat and then becomes dimensional. But again, with this specific series that you're looking at the moment, I was really thinking about how can I create a, a form with its most limited amount of parts, because it really felt like something was missing. So that process of loss really, I really wanted to explore creating objects that felt like there was a part that was supposed to be there. So if you look at, for example, these two triangular forms that are, kind of look like pyramids, but aren't pyramids. It's like one side of that pyramid is completely missing, and really they feel and look incomplete. And the only thing that completes them is their shadow. And so for me, that was a conversation about how do you continue in the um, in the real life when it feels like something or someone is really gone, and starting to think about that.
Mhm.
um, I feel like I also just want to say I threw this slide in here because there is a relationship between the two-dimensional work and the three-dimensional work, where I will create these installations and then go back into the studio and really make work in reaction to these forms with a lot of the same vocabulary. And I'm really interested in that. I'm interested in going back and forth that way, and that they don't feel like they feel like they're in conversation with each other. And so that is something that's important to me, that I don't feel like I can often say everything with one medium.
Yes.
Um, oh, that's right. So I actually wanted to talk a little bit more about video, and that's what I have the next couple slides. Let me see if I can get my PowerPoint to go. Sorry, guys, it's just taking a second. The little wheel is there. But in the next video that I wanted to show you guys, I apologize about that, is one that really is starting to lead into the current body of work. So within the same period of time in 2017 and 18 that I lost my father, I was driving back and forth from Phoenix to Reno a number of times. And being again, back in the car, I feel like being in the car and that process of commuting and just traveling. And I love the process in being in the car, because you are standing still and you're moving 100 miles an hour at the same time, and that there's a duality within that experience itself. And within this video, it's a view that we often have all seen while driving, mostly if you're anywhere in the in the west of the United States, where you have a landscape outside of your window, and then the reflection in the rear view mirror. And the reason why this piece was really a kind of a catalyst for me, and I don't know if it's going to play, it might not, I have a little video on here, it might not, is that I started to see this image as something that is very formal within the way that we create um, images, or within a historical way of thinking about painting or creating art, where often the image on the right of the picture plane is talking about the future. And in the way that this is framed, the past is placed in its place. And in this duality of seeing a video of the landscapes speeding next to you and what is being reflected behind you, really we're looking at the present and the past, and they are occupying the entire picture plane. And you can see the present and experience it, but you can't see the future at all. So like you can't, in this image, you can't see what's ahead. You can only see what's behind you. And as the two are happening at the same time, you see the same, these two views at the same time, the landscape tries to meet, tries to merge itself. That horizon line starts to undulate and for a minute make itself whole and make itself one image, and then it breaks apart again. And I was so fascinated about how this was really, again, a metaphor for what I was experiencing, that I was in the moment. I knew I was moving forward, but I felt like I couldn't see what was ahead. And the only thing that I could really wish was that I could experience what was behind me and what was in the past. And that I could somehow make the present and the past meet, even for a minute, to deal with that idea of loss. And so, again, all of a sudden, I found the video was going to be able to start to talk about longing in a way that some of the two-dimensional work couldn't quite capture it for me, and really started to be excited about how having a time-based work could create something that had a lot of tension and a lot of like a moment where you felt like you weren't very comfortable because you didn't know what was about to happen or what was happening in the image. And so that experience of the viewer, I was really excited about that, because that I felt like that's something I really wanted in the work, because that's something I was experiencing.
Beautiful. I think that's a wonderful place to lead into your current exhibition.
Yes. So, so currently I'm actually Zooming from my current exhibition at Sierra Arts Gallery in Reno, Nevada. And this series of work is called Memory of a Landscape. And in this series of work, I'm again thinking about this idea of place and time, but working this time in painting. And within this work, I really wanted to bring back this idea of landscape. And similar to the video, I was just talking about like landscape in a very traditional sense. So this idea that we put a frame around an image that's idealized, and that landscape itself is idealized. But I was really interested in landscape because I think that represents past, present, and future. It represents time. So as we access or like revisit a place that we have been before, but we find really beautiful, like if you're camping or going on a road trip, or just even being in your own backyard, when you're looking at that landscape, you're thinking about all the times that you've been there before, all the previous experiences that you have had with that idealized space. And landscape can be about that. It can be about the past. It can be about a marker of something that had happened at that location. But it can also be about the present. I feel like today in our, crazy world, being outside in nature is one of the only times that we get to let go and be in the moment, and, like be in the now. And also landscape is a representation of the future. So often we get to see what's ahead, see that vista, like we can literally see where we're going by looking at that horizon line and that expanse. But as I'm thinking about landscape as this metaphor of past, present, and future, I also think that we reflect a lot of ourselves onto these idealized spaces or idealized images of landscape. And so I'm using this reflective ribbon in silver leaf to create a barrier between the viewer and the landscape itself, to really start to create a metaphor about what we bring to that landscape and that viewing experience that is actually a reflection about us. And so within these pieces, I'm painting from like a mere mylar ribbon, and then the landscapes behind each of these pieces are created from my personal photography that I have taken throughout time. And they might even be like photographs that are not necessarily like a good photo, but something that I can take back into the studio and kind of reimagine and re-idealize, but then placing these other forms in front of it to represent what we're bringing. And then this work also has a video component to it. Sadly enough, my videos aren't playing, but that's okay. You can see them on my website. And so these videos are also representing this kind of mylar ribbon that I'm pulling back into the studio with the landscape behind it. And they are being affected by the nature that they're in. So you will see them flutter and slightly move with the wind and the elements that they're sitting in the midst of. So this exhibit is a collection of both paintings and video, and I'm going to try to go to the next slide, but I think because I tried to play the video and the Zoom's not allowing me to do everything that I wanted, which was to show images and video and be able to broadcast at the same time, which is totally okay because there's other ways to access that information. But the show is really a conversation between those videos and the two-dimensional work. But I do feel like the paintings are hopefully capturing this feeling of something that's temporary, something that feels like it's fleeting, which I was really excited to create within this body of work.
Wonderful. Is that the last slide?
It is the last.
Oh,
it is.
okay.
Yeah. Do you want to go to this?
Yes. Well, we can go to the next one with the
Sure.
quote. Yeah. So, in the words of Ken Taylor, one of our deepest needs is for a scene of identity and belonging, and a common denominator in this human attachment to the landscape and how we find identity in landscape and place. And so, one of the questions that I asked you, and this was just like me looking at these paintings and looking at the formal decisions of keeping the linen exposed and then having like these shiny these silver strands kind of coming to the foreground. And I was wondering, is your are these paintings a search for like making sense of your immigrant experience?
Yeah. So I mean, like we talked a little bit about this, and I just thought it was such a interesting question to bring up. Like often this idea of like a path or there's often a relationship between wanting to create ideas of paths and relate them in terms of time. And I think that all of that comes from just immigrating to the United States as a child. So we immigrated as a family in the early 90s. I was 10 years old when that happened. And, I moved from Bulgaria, which I had grown up in a communist country, and moved to the United States. And it was really a culture shock. And one thing that I've never been able to shake in my life is this feeling that that I've had two lives. That there's a life that forked. I often think of it like I was in one river, and then there was like this experience, this rock, and there was two paths that formed around this rock. And I am on one, but the other one feels like it still continues. It feels like it's always there. It's in the shadow. It's going parallel to me. And for some reason, for me, that experience has really created a personal awareness of how time feels like it's moving or fleeting or disappearing or about to, like about to run out, or just this feeling that it's in constant movement and that we're in constant movement within time. And so there's a lot of longing in that. And then there's a lot of, I don't know, like you have a second shadow. I don't know how to explain it exactly.
Well, I mean, I love that in this whole presentation that you have had words for everything, but that this is the question that stumps you, because the unknown is what I was picking up on, right? Like there's this for me, obviously having this connection to landscape in El Salvador, and then coming to the United States and having to like hold on to something and ground into something, and landscape was nature was the one place that I could do that.
Yeah.
And I found it really fascinating that you're painting the same landscape that you arrived to.
Yes.
That you're
And it keeps calling me back, which is really interesting too, because well, specifically, like, so we ended up immigrating to Reno, and at first Reno and its landscape in the high desert was very foreign and alien and brown and like maybe not as beautiful as the lush green of Bulgaria. And through like experience and time and just being able to go out there again and again, what you find is subtlety. And what I actually love about the Nevada landscape is that it's this is actually a quote from a friend of mine, a teacher of mine, but she called these hills naked. That they, like that they are naked, and that they are unashamed. And so there's something about this Nevada landscape that's also um, open, open to interpretation, exposed, not protected, um, and lonely. And all of that is actually things that I get really excited about. Which before, or maybe as a child, I found maybe intimidating, or again foreign and alien. And now it's I love all those things, and I like want to continue to feel those things. And so that landscape just keeps calling to me because it has so much longing in it.
yeah. And so it really makes sense, I think, in looking at the love and attention that you've put into the work, the specificity of like the quality of the light and the viscosity of the paint, and making paint feel as if it's blurring past us as well, like the landscape is blurring
Mm-hmm.
past us, and you're definitely directing our focus and stopping my body, to be present in this moment, and taken in by this abstract ribbon. So yeah, I think that that's actually a really good place to kind of come, to wrap, to
Sure.
encompass all of your ideas in this work.
Do you think we should stop sharing, or do you like where do you want to do next?
Well,
Should we just stop sharing and go to maybe questions, or what do you?
sure. Yes. I mean, it's kind of nice to keep the slides up. I know that Hannah had a question
Okay.
earlier on, and her question was in connection with the books. And I don't know, Hannah, if we answered your question, but Hannah said, I'm interested in the connection between the book form and the idea of landscape. And so if you wanted to go back to those, you could, and talk about that. And if
Yeah.
you have additional questions, you can go ahead and type them into the chat box.
Let me see. if I can.
Hannah, did you have a follow-up question to that?
Well, I guess because like the conversation has been connection to this new work,
Mm-hmm.
and so but one of the things I noticed looking at these sculptures is they tend to read more like sculpture than book. But
Mm-hmm.
then when you look at it, it's very clear that the traditional quality of bookbinding is present in the work. Like if you just wanted them to be on a little colored rectangle, you wouldn't have gone through the trouble to make them book covers. And
Right.
so it seems to me that the element of book is also really critical in this series. And I might be speaking because I have one of your little books and I love it, and so I'm just interested in that significant of it being a book form as the
Mm-hmm.
sort of platform to hold this sculpture.
So I think that I was really excited about book forms, and I feel like you can start to see it in the sculpture too, is that there's something about this process of collapse. I was really interested that I could put something away and then bring it back out. And that there would be a process that like, you could almost do it meditatively, like you could do it every day. And like it would just be this thing that you can like put away and it would become two-dimensional and pop back out, become three-dimensional. And I do love the idea that it was held and that it was protected, and that these covers were giving it another kind of structure, and also this ability to get put away. That I think that some of the sculptures actually do that too. Part of there's so many reasons why I did that, including not being able to work big in a small space unless that piece could fold away. And so, when we come to these installation pieces, and sorry, I'm just trying to exit back out of here so that I can go to the next slide. So when it comes to these, like I couldn't fit these kind of pieces through a door, for example. Like they couldn't be in an interior space unless they were collapsible. But unlike the books, they no longer exist. And there's something about those covers that allow the book to be protected. I don't know. There's something very there's something about that I just really love, that they feel like they're coddled. They feel like they get to get put away and they get to be taken care of because they have those covers. Did you have a follow up for that? I'm happy to.
Thank you. That was I loved hearing that bit about the protection. So thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, held and protected. Feel free to unmute yourself if you have questions for Rossi. Well, I wrote down held and protected and cherished, and the care that you put into the care and thought that you put into all of the pieces is really what I think draws me into the work. So really beautiful presentation, Rossi. Thank you to everyone for taking your time, taking Saturday morning to join us in looking at Rossi's current body of work, but also seeing all of the beautiful connections that have been happening over the last 10 or more years. So Rossi, you were a wonderful sport in allowing for me to ask all of these questions about the previous bodies of work. So
no, thank you, and thank you for helping me create this structure. I also just want to say that today is actually the last day of the exhibition. I am going to do, with Claudia's encouragement, I'm going to do an Instagram live tour after this, and you can find me on Instagram at Rossitza. So it's just my first name, Rossitza. So I think that whenever we finish, or maybe closer to 11:30, I'm going to do that and just walk people through the gallery, and be able to ask questions or answer questions in a much more private way. I'll also be in the gallery if you're local until 3.
And Rossi, I think don't you have a slide that has also the information at the end too? It might be nice for people to see.
Yes. Let me see if I can get there without it being too jarring. Sorry, let's just go. I think you'll have to go through the whole thing. So just give me a second so that I can click through. Any other questions before we wrap up?
Wonderful. There we go.
Yeah, there we go. Sometimes it won't let me do that.
There it is. So there's the information for Instagram Live and Rossi's gallery tour, live gallery tour. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Take good care, and yeah, you know where to find us. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
It was a
Thanks
great
for joining.
talk.
Thank
Thanks.
you.